All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Old Testament.
Okay.
Leviticus Chapter 21, to be exact.
Interesting.
Yeah, we're going to explore all the rules and expectations for priests in ancient Israel.
Oh.
I think it's going to be a fascinating look into their beliefs and values and really just a window into the past, you know?
Absolutely, I agree.
And you know what makes this deep dive even more interesting is that our source material today is the King James Version, online.
Okay.
But it includes a commentary by Matthew Henry, who was a 17th century theologian.
So we're going to get like the original text
Right.
and then someone's interpretation of it layered on top.
Exactly. So it kind of adds a whole other layer to what we're going to be exploring.
I like it.
So let's just jump right into the text itself.
Okay.
In Leviticus 21, verses 1 through 4,
Right.
we find these rules about priests and defilement from contact with the dead.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't even mourn just anyone, could they?
Well, it's important to remember that purity laws in ancient Israel weren't really about hygiene like we think of it.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like, wash your hands.
Yeah.
It was all about maintaining ritual purity.
Oh,
It was about a spiritual alignment
I see.
that allowed priests to act as intermediaries between God and the people.
Oh, okay. So they had to maintain this purity
Exactly. Yeah.
to be able to fulfill that role.
Right. And contact with the dead was considered very defiling. It could potentially disrupt that connection between the priest and God.
Okay, so those rules make a lot more sense now.
Yeah.
But I'm also seeing some exceptions here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like for immediate family.
Right.
So what do you think about these exceptions? What's their significance?
That's a good point. It's really interesting because it kind of shows that tension that must have existed between family duty and priestly duty.
Yeah, like how do you choose
Exactly.
you're a priest but also a son
Exactly.
or a brother?
Yeah, even a priest was expected to honor their parents or siblings.
Right.
It's almost like a human dilemma that we can still relate to.
Absolutely.
Even today.
Oh, for sure.
How do we balance our obligations to family
Yes.
with maybe a larger purpose or calling?
Absolutely, yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, like back then, how did priests navigate those competing loyalties?
Right.
But this idea of separation, right, of what's sacred and what's profane, I mean, it goes beyond just death, right?
Absolutely.
We see it in verses 5 through 8, which deal with, like, outward appearance.
Ah, interesting.
No haircuts, no trimming your beard,
Right.
no body modifications for priests.
Wow.
So why this emphasis on physical signs?
Well, you have to remember, priests were seen as representatives of God to the people.
Right.
Their appearance had to kind of like reflect that connection,
It was like a visual representation of their role.
Right. It set them apart.
Yeah.
It was a way of conveying that sacred role, like a uniform.
Oh, like a uniform, yeah.
And it's so fascinating, how
Yeah.
these outward symbols
Yeah.
connect to this deeper internal state of holiness, supposedly.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it also makes you wonder,
Hmm.
how much do we judge by appearances even today?
Oh, all the time.
Right. I mean, we might not have priestly robes,
Yeah,
but first impressions matter.
totally.
Dress codes still carry a lot of weight.
Absolutely. It's like we're just hardwired to
Yeah.
make assumptions based on what we see.
Definitely.
Okay, well, speaking of assumptions, let's move on to the rules around marriage
Oh,
and the priesthood.
all right.
Verses 7, 9, and 13 through 15 lay out some pretty specific restrictions on who a priest could marry.
Okay.
And frankly, some of it is just harsh, especially by today's standards.
Yeah, I can see that.
No marrying a woman who's been divorced
Oh, wow.
or, as the text puts it, profane.
Interesting.
So what do you think the underlying concern was here?
Well, it all goes back to that emphasis on purity
Right.
and lineage,
Yeah.
particularly for the high priest.
Right.
It was crucial that his offspring be considered unblemished
Okay.
because they would carry on that priestly line.
Yeah.
The whole idea was to maintain the sacredness of that lineage
Right.
across generations.
It's interesting because the text also uses pretty strong language here.
Yeah, it does.
It talks about profaning his seed. So could you maybe unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure.
What are the implications of this idea of inherited holiness?
Well, it may seem strange to us now,
Yep.
but they believe that holiness wasn't just an individual quality.
Uh-huh.
It could be passed down through generations.
Oh, wow.
So a priest's actions could actually impact not just his own spiritual standing,
Right.
but also that of his descendants.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is, isn't it?
I can see the logic in wanting to preserve a lineage,
Yeah.
Yeah. Dedicated to religious service. But I don't know, it makes you wonder about the pressure on those individuals.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a very different way of thinking than our modern emphasis on individual choice and autonomy.
It is. It raises questions about the balance between
Right.
individual freedom and communal responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a tension that societies are still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges, the next section of Leviticus 21 deals with physical imperfections and how that impacted someone's eligibility for priestly service.
Interesting.
Yeah, verses 16 through 23 go into a lot of detail about what physical conditions would disqualify you from serving as a priest.
Wow.
And I have to say, from a modern perspective, it feels very discriminatory.
I can understand that.
So what was the reasoning behind these rules?
Well, you got to remember, they believed the priest, as a representative of God, had to embody perfection.
Right.
So any imperfection, whether it was a physical disability or a skin condition,
Right.
it was seen as marring that image.
Okay, but the person with the imperfection wasn't punished, right?
Right.
It's not like they were
No,
ostracized from society or anything.
they just couldn't perform certain rituals.
So was it seen as like a personal failing on their part then?
It's hard to say for sure how individuals were actually viewed. There
Right.
was probably a stigma attached to those conditions, even though the text emphasizes that it was about the role and not the individual's inherent worth.
Right. It still makes you think
It does.
about how those beliefs about physical perfection might have impacted the lives of people with disabilities in ancient Israel.
Right. It's a good reminder that even sacred texts can reflect the complexities and sometimes the prejudices of their time.
Yeah, but before we go any further there,
Okay.
let's pivot for a second to the commentary we
Wow.
mentioned earlier by Matthew Henry.
Right.
So he was a 17th century commentator, and he offers a fascinating Christian interpretation.
Oh.
He sees the priest as a, quote, type of Christ, end quote.
Interesting. And so what does that mean?
Yeah, like what does that mean?
How does he explain that?
Yeah.
Well, essentially, he's layering new meaning onto the Old Testament through this Christian lens.
Right.
He's arguing that Jesus, as the ultimate high priest, fulfills that ideal of purity and perfection that Leviticus lays out.
So how does this interpretation, this idea of Christ as the perfect high priest, how does that change how we might understand Leviticus today?
Well, for one thing, it shifts the focus away from outward appearances and strict adherence to the law.
So less about don't touch that dead body.
Exactly.
And more about the state of your soul.
Yes,
It
exactly.
becomes less about ritual purity and more about spiritual purity.
Exactly.
And that's something that everyone, regardless of their beliefs, can connect with, right?
I guess so, yeah.
This idea of inner goodness or a connection to something bigger
Absolutely.
than ourselves.
Absolutely. It's a very human thing.
It is. It's very human. And so it prompts us to ask, then, what does it really mean to be good or pure in a modern context?
It's a good question.
Is it about following rules perfectly?
Yeah.
Or is it about something deeper?
Right. And if we think of ourselves as these priests,
Yes.
metaphorically offering up our lives to something larger,
Yes.
what does that even look like?
What are our sacrifices?
Right. What are our rituals?
It's a really interesting way to think about it.
It is. It's taking this ancient text and applying it to our lives today.
Yeah, it's amazing how these ancient texts can still resonate so strongly.
I know. It's incredible.
But let's be real. Some of those Leviticus rules just seem bizarre
Oh,
to
yeah.
modern readers.
Totally.
Like, seriously, burning someone with fire.
Oh, what was it again?
Oh, yeah, Leviticus 21.9.
It mentions that the daughter of a priest who profanes herself by playing the whore shall be burnt with fire.
Okay, but what does that even mean in this context? Playing the whore.
Yeah, it's a very loaded term.
It feels like it's about more than just sex.
You're right to be cautious with the language.
Yeah.
We're dealing with an ancient text here.
Yeah.
It reflects a patriarchal society.
Of course.
Very different ideas about sexuality, especially for women.
So it was less about the act itself and more about, like, disrupting the purity
I think
of the priestly lineage.
Exactly. It was about maintaining that line of inherited holiness.
Oh.
And any action that threatened that was a serious, serious transgression.
It's still a tough verse to stomach.
It is.
It's a good reminder that even these sacred texts can reflect those prejudices and power dynamics of their time.
Definitely.
It's up to us to read them critically.
Right.
And to grapple with those uncomfortable parts.
I agree.
But it does raise another interesting point.
Yeah.
You know, while some of these verses might seem outdated, the idea of the individual and the community is still so relevant.
Absolutely. Back then, there was such a strong emphasis on collective identity.
Right.
On the well-being of the group as a whole.
Like we were talking about with inherited holiness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How a priest's actions could impact his entire lineage.
It's a very different perspective.
It is.
Than our modern focus on individualism.
It really is. And it raises questions for us today.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, how much do we prioritize individual rights and freedoms over the needs of the community?
It's a hard question.
Where do we draw the line?
Right. It's a constant tension.
It is.
We see it everywhere, right?
Everywhere, yeah.
Healthcare, education, the environment.
Absolutely.
Even though we might not agree with every single rule in Leviticus, it does force us to think about these fundamental questions.
About how we live together in a society. Exactly. How do we create a society that balances the needs of the individual with the needs of the community?
It's the question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
It really is a big question. And this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
I agree.
Leviticus is so much more than just a list of ancient rules.
It is.
It's a reflection of a complex society.
Yes.
Grappling with huge questions about holiness, purity, leadership, the relationship between the individual and the community.
And those questions are still relevant today.
They are.
As we navigate our own complex world.
We've only just scratched the surface of Leviticus Chapter 21, folks.
I know, right?
There's so much more to explore.
So much more.
So much more to uncover.
Can't wait.
So stay tuned because we're going to continue our deep dive into this fascinating and very thought-provoking text.
It is fascinating. It's really amazing, you know, how Leviticus still manages to be so relevant today.
Yeah, I know, right? You would think a text that old would feel like totally outdated.
You would. But it's not. It keeps coming back to these really fundamental questions about human nature.
And how we relate to each other, right?
Exactly. Like that whole thing about individual responsibility versus social responsibility. That's still something we're figuring out.
Oh, totally. And it seems like back then, the emphasis was much more on the community.
Oh, absolutely. The collective good.
Right. Like everyone being on the same page.
Yeah, like that concept of inherited holiness.
Oh, right. Where your actions could, like, affect your whole family line.
Exactly. It wasn't just about you as an individual.
It's so different from how we think today.
It really is. It makes you wonder how that collective mindset influenced their views on things like leadership.
Oh, interesting.
Or even social justice.
I mean, Leviticus doesn't really address those issues directly, right?
Not in the way we understand them today.
Right.
But I think it does offer some clues, you know?
Like what?
Well, for example, that whole thing about ritual purity and how those with physical imperfections were excluded.
Yeah.
You could argue that was a way to maintain social order.
Right.
Reinforce a kind of hierarchy.
Yeah, it's like these texts, even sacred ones.
Right.
They're still products of their time.
Absolutely. They reflect the social and political realities.
Yeah, even if we don't agree with everything in Leviticus.
Of course.
It still makes us think about those big questions.
Yeah.
Individual rights versus communal responsibility.
Exactly. And it's a conversation we're still having.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about all the debates we have.
I know, right?
Public health, social welfare, climate change.
It's like Leviticus is whispering to us across the centuries, like, hey, have you figured this out yet?
Right. What are your obligations to each other?
How do you create a fair and compassionate society?
Big questions.
I mean, philosophers have been wrestling with this stuff for ages.
And we're still trying to find the answers. So it's pretty cool how Leviticus ties into all of that.
It is. But for now, let's maybe shift gears a bit.
Okay, where are we going?
Let's go back to that Christian interpretation of Leviticus.
Right, the idea that the priest kind of foreshadows Christ.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking idea.
It is. So remind me, what was Matthew Henry's take on this again?
Well, he argued that Jesus, as the ultimate high priest, embodies that ideal of purity and perfection that we see in Leviticus.
Okay, so how does that change things for, like, modern readers?
Well, it kind of shifts the emphasis, right?
From what to what?
it becomes less about blindly following the rules and more about this internal transformation.
So less about the letter of the law, more about the spirit of it.
Exactly.
It's like, it's not about outward appearances anymore.
It's about the state of your heart.
That's something anyone can connect with.
I think so. It's a very human thing.
Right. This desire for meaning, for something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, and it kind of reframes the whole idea of being a priest.
Okay, how so?
Well, maybe we're all priests, in a way.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Offering up our lives, not as a literal sacrifice,
Right.
but through our actions, our choices.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's like, what are our modern day sacrifices?
Our rituals, right? What are the things we do?
Exactly. What are the things we do?
To connect with something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
It's really cool how we can take this ancient text and apply it to our lives in such a meaningful way.
I agree, but we also have to acknowledge,
What's that?
that some parts of Leviticus are just really tough to swallow today.
Oh, totally. Like that verse about burning the priest's daughter.
Right. It's a harsh reminder that times were different.
Social norms were different.
Absolutely. And we can't shy away from that.
Yeah. It's important to look at it critically.
To understand the context.
And to learn from it, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
I agree.
But it also brings us back to this theme. Individual versus community.
Ah, yes, that's the thread that runs through all of this.
Leviticus is all about that balance.
And we're still trying to find that balance today.
We are. It's a constant struggle.
In so many areas of life.
Like we were saying, healthcare, the environment, social justice.
Leviticus might not give us all the answers.
Yeah.
But it definitely makes us ask the right questions.
It does. It's like a roadmap for how to think about these big issues.
And that's pretty amazing for a text that's thousands of years old.
I know, right? It's pretty cool how it can still speak to us today.
It really is.
So where do we go from here?
Well, we've only scratched the surface of Leviticus 21.
There's so much more to unpack.
I know, so many layers to peel back.
I can't wait to see what else we uncover.
Me too. It's going to be fascinating.
It's kind of wild how these ancient texts, they really can act as a mirror,
Yeah.
Reflecting back to us our own values and beliefs.
They really do. It's fascinating.
And Leviticus, with all its talk of ritual purity, separating the sacred from the profane, it offers such a unique perspective on how those concepts played out in ancient Israel.
It's like a whole different way of thinking.
Right. And it's easy to get kind of bogged down, in all the specific rules and regulations.
Yeah.
But I think what's really interesting is, the bigger picture,
What do you mean?
Like the underlying worldview that it reveals.
Oh, okay, yeah.
This idea that holiness, it wasn't just, about religion. It was about everything.
It permeated their whole lives.
Exactly, like how you dressed, who you married, even how you dealt with death.
It's like they saw the sacred in every aspect of life.
Yeah, and that's something that I think still resonates with us, even today.
I agree. Maybe we don't use the same language.
Right. We don't talk about ritual purity.
Exactly.
But we still have our own ideas about what it means to be a good person.
Or to live ethically.
Right. To live with integrity.
And Leviticus, it really emphasizes that connection between the individual and the community. Yeah. It makes us think about how those individual values, they play out on a larger scale.
It's that constant tension, right?
Between individual freedom and communal responsibility.
Exactly. And I think Leviticus offers a really a thought-provoking perspective.
Oh, absolutely.
On that age-old dilemma.
It forces us to confront those big questions.
About how we live together as a society.
How do we balance individual rights with the needs of the community?
Right. How do we create a system that is both just and compassionate?
I mean, those are questions that we're still grappling with.
I know. They're like universal human questions, aren't they?
They are. And Leviticus, written thousands of years ago, it's still wrestling with them.
And maybe it's even more relevant now,
Oh, so?
Because we're facing such complex challenges today.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Climate change, inequality, all this technology changing so fast.
It's like we need that ancient wisdom now more than ever.
Right. We need to think beyond ourselves.
About the planet, about future generations.
And Leviticus reminds us that we're all connected. That our actions have consequences and we have a responsibility.
To each other.
To each other, yeah.
And to the world around us.
It's a powerful message, isn't it?
It really is. And one that I think transcends any specific religion or culture.
It's about being human.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have, but we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? Leviticus Chapter 21, there's still so much to uncover.
So many more layers to explore.
And who knows what other insights and revelations await us.
It's an invitation to keep learning, keep digging.
Exactly, and to keep those conversations going.
Yeah, share your thoughts, your questions.
Engage with these ancient texts in a way that's meaningful to you.
That's what it's all about.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, folks.
It flew by.
But until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.
I love that.